That was author and theologian J.I. Packer talking there about faith. It was filmed 4 years ago. Now, Packer actually died just a couple of months ago at the age of 93. He had lived a life of faith in Jesus. Wasn't that wonderful, what he had to share with us? Now, 9 years ago, Stephen Frayne walked up to the edge of the Thames River in London. He steps onto a floating pontoon and then puts a foot over the edge and steps onto the water. As a crowd gathers, this man in a bright red coat walks steadily along for a couple of minutes until a police boat eventually comes and picks him up. Stephen Frayne actually goes by the stage name Dynamo. You may have heard of him. He's a street magician. Now, obviously, Dynamo wasn't actually walking on the water. The likelihood is that there were some perspex platforms just below the level of the water in order to hold him up, and since it's not exactly crystal clear water in the Thames, no one would have noticed them. And sorry if I've just ruined the magic for you. It's not just because magicians have mimicked the miracle that Jesus himself performs that I mention that. For many people, faith is a bit like magic. It's something some people have, but the rest have had the magic ruined because it's been shown that it's not based upon reality. Many people see that the modern era has either given us reasons for not even believing in God at all, or for seeing that the miracles and stories of the Bible are probably just exaggerations. But there are many reasons why people of faith continue to have faith in God and in the things that Jesus did, exactly as recorded in the Bible. For one thing, these things were written down by eyewitnesses within a few decades of the events, and it changed the people's lives who saw these things to the extent that they were literally willing to stake their lives upon it. What's more, Jesus still changes people's lives today in the same way as he did back then, because that's what faith does to us. It changes our lives. Faith, you see, is not just wishfully hoping that something might be true, but is being utterly convinced by these things as reality, so that it takes over your life. Faith is not just agreeing to an ideology or a set of statements, but is coming to know a person, coming to know Jesus himself and relating to him. Faith has its beginning in coming to know Jesus as the one who can come and connect you to God. He came to satisfy your deepest longings and forgive all of your greatest failures so that you could live a life of faith in him. As Packer said, faith is not a general optimism or hopefulness about the future. You only have faith when you have learned to trust God, trust his word, and treat him as a partner in your life whom you are trusting. So this episode in Jesus' life is one that tells us about faith. What's just happened before the walking on the water is that Jesus has fed a crowd of well over 5,000 people with nothing but a packed lunch of 5 small flatbreads and 2 fish. Before he actually fed the 5,000 though, he tested his disciples' faith by asking them to be the ones who provided the food. And when they came up short, he demonstrated that they could have acted through faith in him because he was the one who was able to provide the food anyway. And then we come to this episode, which takes things even further about faith. So let me show you from this passage 4 ways that faith works in us. Firstly, that faith instills courage. Jesus has sent his disciples on a boat while he dismisses the crowd, and then he spends the night in prayer. He must have been a long time because the disciples were already perhaps a couple of miles across this very long lake, a quarter of the way, but they were struggling. The wind was very hard against them and it was blowing a gale. In a very non-dramatic way, the words here simply say in verse 25 that he went out to them, walking on the lake. It sounds so undramatic the way it's put, but to the disciples this was very dramatic, terrifying even. It's not quite light yet, it's a little bit dark, and to see a figure walking along the surface of the water in the early morning nighttime sky, it would have been very alarming to say the least. Matthew, who would have been in that boat, he records here that they thought they were seeing a ghost. I mean, how would you react if you were in their shoes? Probably in the same kind of way. I remember as a kid being quite scared of ghosts at one stage, and that was just because I watched a program about people who claimed to see ghosts. The next words, though, are brilliant in verse 27, where Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." He doesn't wait for them to be at the end of their tether. He immediately speaks to them in their fears, and he calls for them to take courage. Not just for any reason, but because it's him. Not only is it not a ghost, but it's the one that they love instead of it being a ghost. And so they don't need to be afraid. Now, there's a lot for us to fear at the moment. Maybe you're afraid of the virus increasing and spreading. Maybe you're fearful for your health or for the health of people that you love. Maybe you're fearful of being in lockdown because you're scared of having freedoms removed again. Maybe you're fearful for your job or your security. Maybe you're fearful for the planet with the climate crisis. Maybe you're fearful for social stability with the different riots and campaigns that there have been recently. Now, there's no promise that Jesus will necessarily take away the circumstances that cause us our fear, but we can take courage by hearing him come to us in our fear. I mean, think about it. Jesus wasn't just walking on the water to demonstrate his power, though it does do that. Jesus was simply finding a way to come and be with his disciples in their fearful moment. And we can likewise know that he is with us in our fearful moments. Jesus speaks a word to us this morning, saying, "Take courage, I am with you, do not be afraid." So faith in Jesus, it instills courage in us, but the second way that it works in us is that faith elicits action. Peter is a bold fellow, perhaps because at the feeding of the crowd, Jesus spoke directly to them to act in faith. So now Peter, being bold as he is, he asks Jesus to direct him to act in faith in the same way that Jesus directed them in the feeding of the 5,000. Now this is almost in order to prove that it really was Jesus out there on the lake. And so Peter says in verse 28, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." And when Jesus calls for him, what does Peter do? Well, he steps out of the boat. He begins to walk on the water. Could you have done that? Could you have stepped out of a boat in a storm, expecting that the choppy water underneath would hold you up? It certainly requires a lot of faith, doesn't it? Now, you've got to be careful when you see something quite daring and you say, "I could do that." Like if you're watching someone doing a tightrope walk, or people diving off cliffs into the water, or seeing someone doing a parachute jump or something daring like that. If you play that down by saying, "Oh, I could do that," well, you've got to be careful, haven't you? Because someone might hear you and say, "Prove it, prove it." And then you have to prove your faith in action. You have to prove that you believe you really could do it by actually doing it. And before you know it, you'll be putting on a parachute and jumping out of a plane. And that's just the thing. Faith is not just a mental exercise. Faith very often starts in our minds and our hearts. We think through the claims of Jesus. We're drawn in affection to what he has done. It's all very internal, isn't it? It's our hearts and our minds. But real faith doesn't just think about it or feel about it. Real faith doesn't just sit back and hope for the best. Real faith is worked out in action. It makes us respond with our lives. There's a word we often use, though, to get us out of action, the word "but." You might say, "I have faith in Jesus, but," and then we excuse ourselves from actually doing anything about it. Peter could have said, "Jesus, I believe you could make me walk on this water, but," and then he would have excused himself. There's no such thing as back in the boat faith with Jesus. If he has called you to come to him, even if it means getting out of a boat onto the stormy sea, you get out and go. Faith requires the Christian to act. It requires the Christian to actually live out their lives of faith, to be committed to growing in our lives and doing good, to be part of a community of fellow believers in Jesus. Faith requires action in caring for the needy and for the poor. Faith requires us to share the good news that Jesus has died for our sins with anyone that will hear it. Jesus calls us to come to him and to do these things and plenty of other things as well. And you know, all of these things are impossible things. It is impossible for us to do any of these things, just like it's impossible to walk on the water. But by faith in Jesus, we are enabled and empowered to act, just like Peter was. So faith, it instills courage in us and then elicits action. Next is that faith anchors trust. Now, Peter gets that sinking feeling, quite literally, because he is sinking. He goes from walking along on the sea to sinking down into it. What makes the difference? Well, he looks at the wind and the waves, and he's afraid. In a moment of fear, he takes his eye off the one who he had faith in and looked at the things that cause him to faith. He's lost that anchor for his trust. Now, we can't be too hard on Peter. It must have been very terrifying, if you can imagine it. Remember, there was this storm going on, and it's not like he was doing something that he's done before and ever would do again. It's not exactly common to walk on water, is it? And we can't be too hard on Peter, well, because very often that's what we're like as well. Not with walking on water, of course. I certainly have never done that. But in living out the Christian life, we do the same thing. We sink all the time. For example, how many times have I, perhaps because there's been a stormy day ahead of me, how many times have I skipped on spending time in the morning focused on the Lord? How many times have I missed an opportunity to share something of Jesus because my focus is on the immediate chaos in my life? How many times have I failed to sacrificially love my family because my mind is not on living for Jesus at that moment? We do it all the time, don't we? And if we miss these everyday opportunities to act in faith because we're sinking down with our eyes off Jesus, well, how many more greater opportunities are we missing as well? What's the solution? It's very simple. Call out to Jesus and let him lift you up, because that's what happens to Peter. His faith buckles under his fear, and he cries out in verse 30, "Lord, save me." And Jesus reaches out his hand and lifts him up, encourages him not to doubt. That's how the Christian life begins, of course. We begin by recognizing that without Jesus we're sinking, and we cry out to him and he lifts us up out of our sin, out of our lack of faith, out of our foolishness and pride, out of our self-centeredness, out of our ignorance of God, and we're brought into his grasp as we're lifted up by him to have faith in him. And if that's how the Christian life begins, then that's how the Christian life is lived every single day that follows that. Not that we have to become a Christian every day like a sitcom that resets itself every episode, but that we go on in our Christian lives by recognizing our own ongoing tendency to falter and our own weakness and inability to sustain ourselves. And so we look to Jesus, we rely upon him, we trust in him. Our faith anchors our trust in him. So faith keeps us looking to him through the storms of life. Faith causes us to cry out to him when we're feeling like we're sinking. And in this, our reliance is upon him. Our trust is in him. So faith instills courage, elicits action, anchors our trust, and finally, faith evokes worship. They climb back into the boat, the wind dies down, and then we get to verse 33. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, for Jewish people who weren't wacky or dodgy in their beliefs, worship was for one person alone, for God. Now, it could be that they're paying homage in the way that you might bow down before royalty, or the kind of esteem that you might show to a celebrity. But couple this bowing down, this worship that they do, with the title that they use for Jesus, the Son of God, and clearly they're beginning to recognize something of Jesus' divine nature, that he is fully God. Now, maybe they don't see it yet fully, but they're surely seeing something of this. Either way, if we have faith, the kind of faith that depends upon Jesus to lift us up and to save us, then we will worship him, recognizing who he is. If we don't have faith, if we don't trust God and don't recognize Jesus for who he is, if he is not our partner in our lives to have his way with us, then we will not worship. We have no reason to worship. But when we do recognize who Jesus is, we should bow down before him. We should recognize his high status as God the Son. We should submit to him so that he has charge of us. And we'll gladly do as he wishes, which is worship in itself. We should declare to him in song and in praise and words of adoration how wonderful he is to us. We should tell him that every day. So do you have faith? Do you have this kind of faith? If not, what holds you back? What keeps you from trusting Jesus to take away your sin and to make you right with him? What keeps you from taking courage amidst fear or acting in faith? What stops you from trusting him to lift you when you get knocked down, or worshipping him as a result of knowing who he is? There's nothing really to hold us back. When we see Jesus for who he is, faith is the obvious response. If you're struggling with faith, pray that God would give you this kind of faith. But if you are one who has faith, then this is the shape that your life is to take. Faith that is courageous, actively trusting, worshipping. May God help us to do so. Let's sing once more, and then I'll pray to close.